Recently, Rockstar Games broke the internet with the trailer for Grand Theft Auto 6. There's not much I can say about this trailer that hasn't been said already, but it just looks phenomenal. The setting, the visuals, it just honestly looks like Rockstar have put a huge amount of work into the game. And while there's a lot of hype for the title itself, of course, it also had a side effect. A lot of folks immediately on things like Twitter were already talking about the PlayStation 5 Pro. Because in theory anyway, it will be the best way to play the game at launch. The PS5 Pro seems to be targeting a release window of the end of 2024. That's what I've said multiple times in my leaks, Tom Henderson, as well as other rumours on the internet. And of course, as we know at this point, the PC release for Grand Theft Auto 6 is God knows. I mean, Rockstar haven't even given us a release window. Microsoft's Xbox Series X console is going to be the most powerful for this generation, at least according to Phil Spencer, and I've heard nothing of a mid-generation refresh as well. So in theory, at least for the first year or two of the game's release, the best way to play it visually, for example, would of course be a PS5 Pro. And as I just said, I've put out a lot of rumours for the PS5 Pro concerning the CPU, the GPU, and a lot of other stuff as well. But there are some new rumours that are swirling around the internet I really want to cover. So many people have been messaging me on Twitter, emails. I've had a number of friends that were like texting me as well while I was at the gym today. Early this morning, I was like, oh my god, I'm trying to do legs, and people are like messaging me about the PS5 Pro. But yeah, I want to thank everyone who has been messaging on like Twitter, Facebook, emails, that type of thing. I do appreciate it. So, because so many folks asked me to cover this stuff, well, here we are. And we're going to get right into it after this quick message from the video sponsor. If you're running a copy of Windows 10 which isn't activated, of course, not only do you have to worry about the missing customization options, but there's also that annoying Windows desktop watermark reminding you to activate. Today's video is sponsored by WhoKeys.com, and they've an excellent price on Windows 10 Professional as well as Home keys. Yeah, and they also of course sell games. I've bought a few Windows 10 keys with my own personal account to test everything was legit and worked in preparation for this sponsored video. You can pick up one of their keys for 25% off using the coupon code RGT in the checkout. There's links to their website in the video description. Also, if you're building a few systems, there's bundles available too. Again, you can check out WhoKeys.com and use the coupon code RGT for 25% off the listed Windows 10 key prices. Now, before we actually get into the full specifications and the nitty-gritty of this, I just want to remind everyone that currently these are rumours. Sony themselves have not confirmed a PlayStation 5 Pro exists. And quite frankly, until they do, it's just a rumour. Now, my sources are pretty adamant that there is an APU, which is going to be utilised for the PS5 Pro. Tom Henderson's got a really good track record. He's talking about a PS5 Pro. There are some other folks as well that are talking about the system. But ultimately, until Mark Cerny or someone else from Sony goes on stage and says, this is when the console is going to launch, anything can happen. I mean, first of all, the rumours could just be incorrect, although I do think they are true. But Sony could just decide to delay the machine. They could decide to just not release it because of various market factors. I mean, let's just face it. Stuff is quite interesting in the world right now. You can take from that as you will, from that statement. So yeah, I mean, anything can happen. And until a product is officially announced, and let's face it, if you're a gamer, if you're interested in tech, you know that a crap ton of projects have been pretty much mothballed. I mean, look at one of the most famous examples for a game anyway is like Star Fox 2 for the SNES. So anyway, with that said, so let's start things out with the CPU because I just think it's going to be the quickest to go through. So Kepler L2 on Twitter as well as myself have both stated that it's going to be based on AMD's Zen 2 processor architecture, once again with a very similar configuration to what we saw with the base model console. Now, I wasn't personally told the cache configuration, however the rumours which have originated on Resetera here are probably not too far out. Now, I was told with the base model system that there was a lot of cache tweaking, especially on L3, and I presume that those tweaks were still going to be present on the Pro model. I would also presume that Sony would ask for the FP units for AVX instructions and stuff like that to be shaved down, just like the base model system, because Sony really does not want people to be using like heavy floating point operations on the CPU. They want those to be compute stuff on the GPU. I was told low 4 gigahertz. I was given a different range. I think it was like 4.2 to 4.3 or something like that gigahertz. So 4.4 does sound in the realm of possibility here. The information I received was a very early engineering sample processor, most likely. So basically, there was a good possibility that the clock frequency could differ versus the retail model. Also, I think a variable clock frequency is very logical. Sony utilized the variable clock frequency on the CPU and GPU, which basically shifts the power around to either of those two things on the APU because of basically a power envelope. Now, essentially speaking, and this gets quite technical, so I'm just going to give you the TLDR here. Sony, Microsoft, when they're producing consoles, and it does apply to Nintendo as well, but their console, the power consumption is really low. Basically, they essentially have agreed to adhere to some set specifications and how much power they can suck from the wall. Now, it gets quite complicated because different devices basically have different power levels that they can draw. For example, like a machine in playing, let's say, like something from Netflix has a different power envelope than, let's say, like a 1080p console, and a 1080p console has a different power consumption figure than, like, say, a 4K console. But this is basically, one of the things that Sony as well as Microsoft have to take into consideration. And there are other things as well, like, for example, silicon yields, heat, actual cost of producing the console, for example, the power distribution on the system, the cooling, etc., etc. So I think a smart shift type approach for the PS5 Pro honestly does make sense, and quite frankly, I think it's going to return for the PS6 as well. Now, this is where my information definitely does differ a little bit from theirs. So they are stating that there are 30 workgroup processors on the actual chip itself. However, 2 are disabled for the retail console. So obviously, if you do complicated maths, we can do 30 minus 2 equals 28. This, however, is not what I heard. I was told that it's 32 total on the APU, and this means that there are going to be 30 remaining. Now, early information that I was given was that there might be 30, but 28 were enabled, but then basically my sources came back to me and said this is probably not correct. Tom Henderson leaked 30 workgroup processors, but his information didn't state whether they were total or the number that were enabled. Now, I'm going to let you guys decide this, because I still think it's 30 enabled, but basically there are a couple of options. Well, these are the most likely, 3 most likely options if I could speak. Sony has cut the specifications due to cost reasons on the APU, making it a little bit smaller. That's option 1. 2, my information wasn't quite right for the newer info, and instead it is 28 enabled, not 30 enabled out of 32. And this new information isn't quite right. Now, it's very possible that this is something to do with like an early engineering silicon. So for example, they were just like kind of testing something, bringing something up, and basically just information can kind of become incorrect. And this happens all of the time. I've certainly done it. Like even if you're typing something to someone, it's a very dumb example, but how many times have you typed in like gigabytes when you meant megabytes, that type of thing? Like, it's really easy just to make a mistake if you're like typing something out and sending it to someone. Like, I was talking to someone on Discord the other day, and I was talking about the number of like workgroup processors, and in my brain I just typed in compute units instead, because, well, I just wasn't thinking, I was in a rush. So stuff can happen, but I do think it is 30 out of 32 which is enabled. I also think that this kind of makes sense based upon my information regarding the shader engines as well. I think that 16 workgroup processors are in each shader engine. Now again, I could be wrong, but that's what I've heard. Now, this is what I definitely, my eyebrow went like, when I heard the clock frequency was 2 gigahertz. I am extremely skeptical that the retail silicon would only be at 2 gigahertz. Now, it's very possible that this is an engineering sample, and that's why. However, this basically would go against the philosophy of the PS5 Pro. So basically this would go against the philosophy of how the original PS5 was developed. Now I'd highly suggest you guys watch Mark Cerny's Road to PS5 event if you haven't. But the reason the PS5 has a higher clock frequency and fewer compute units such workgroup processors, remember there's 36 total, is because basically speaking, when you have a narrower GPU, when you have fewer ALUs, compute units, workgroup processors, whatever you want to say, they are different. ALUs, of course, go in each compute unit, and there are 2 compute units per workgroup processor. But basically, when you have a narrower GPU, it's easier to keep the actual GPU filled with data, in other words, utilization high, and that's good. You don't want like shaders that are doing crap, that are doing absolutely nothing. Now, when you're running them at higher clock frequency, this does benefit things like TFLOPS, but that's not really the reason that Sony have done this. The first, as I just said, is utilization. To have a fewer number of compute units running at high speed is because of utilization, but it also benefits other things, like you're just moving data through the GPU much faster. The caches go faster as well, and caches work on, like, you know, not milliseconds, but nanoseconds. And it's really easy to say, you know, especially if you're not like a developer or a programmer or whatever, and I'm not, but I've spoken to them, it's like, it's very easy to say something like, oh, it's only an extra, you know, couple of nanoseconds, or it's only a few extra cycles. Well, that can be the difference between actually hitting a frame of animation when you're getting work done and not. So all of this stuff is really important, and I'm missing a lot of technical details here, but basically speaking, I was told by multiple people the PS5 Pro the base PlayStation 5 specs were actually changed. Now, the original PS5, so this was before it became like a physical design. So this was when Sony were basically screwing around very early on. I heard they were going for 42 compute units rather than 36, but they couldn't get the clock frequency high enough, so they wouldn't hit the clock frequency target. And basically their own developers, so the likes, this is an example, I don't specifically know the developers, but for example, Naughty Dog, they told them, dudes, I care more about the clock frequency rather than the number of ALUs, essentially. So they decided to clock the GPU high and to go to 36. Now, I can't confirm that as in like official information, but again, multiple people have told me that's true. Now, the speed I heard was the GPU was going to run on the PS5 Pro 2500 to 2800 megahertz. Now, I'm guessing that this is possibly a case where my information is correct. I would love to see, however, if I am wrong, and I'm definitely saying that I could be. Like, at the end of the day, I am not whispering in Mark Cerny's ear. He is not calling me on the phone, and information can be wrong when you're dealing with, like, multiple sources. So it's very possible that my information is wrong, but I would love to see if this information is true, the reason they've done it. It would mean that the GPU is significantly different. Now, it's possible that they couldn't get the number of workgroup processors hitting that kind of speed with the power consumption figures they wanted with the PS5 Pro, and so they running at lower speed for like pro models. Sorry, for pro games, for pro patched games. And for base model games, they would disable some of the workgroup processors, some of the compute units, and they run them at the original speed because obviously it needs backwards compatibility. But my guess is, I think it's more likely that the PS5 Pro's speed is higher. So we'll wait and see. I've also heard hybrid RDNA 3 multiple times, so that does match up. Frankly, I've heard a lot of stuff regarding the IP. One person said it's kind of like Strix Point from AMD, which has just been announced, which actually has some RDNA 4 elements. Yes, that's a real thing. Yes, AMD have officially announced it. They haven't announced Sarlacc yet, which is a higher end APU, which have already leaked the specs of, but that's beside the point. I have heard from one source that there is a custom set of things that Sony have done for the ray tracing units, but I've had other sources essentially tell me that this is untrue. I'm also a little skeptical about SER from NVIDIA, or and it's kind of like shader execution reordering. This is for when you're running like ray tracing commands on the GPU, you're basically making them run in a more efficient order. I know RDNA 3 does not include that. As far as I know, RDNA 4 from AMD doesn't include that either, based on the leaks that I've personally heard, although I do know that there are some improvements to the ray tracing. As far as I know anyway, I'd love to be wrong, but as far as I know, RDNA 4 does not have SCR. RDNA 5 may have it, but I can't be certain. I haven't got anything very specific about that for RDNA 5. So if Sony have included that, that would be a custom thing, at least to my knowledge. And again, I would love for them to have done it, because I'd be quite curious. They also state that it has dual issue. So dual issue is something which gets, let's say, quite complicated. Now, I'm leaving a couple of links in the video description. If you want to know about RDNA 3 and dual issue, I would recommend you read that. I'm going to give you a very simplified example, or explanation, should I say, of what actually it is. However, I'm missing a lot of the technical nuance, because otherwise it's going to take a long time to go through this, because not all instructions run, because some are like... Basically, this does not apply to like integer-based operations, for example, and it becomes quite complicated. And a website like HW Cooling, as well as Chips and Cheese, which again I've left some links to in the video description, they've done some micro benchmarking, so you can kind of get an idea better how this works, and they also go into the technical breakdown of actually what this means. But Xbox Series X, PS5, as well as RDNA 2 class GPUs on the PC, so for example the 6800 XT, they will all use RDNA 2 based compute units, and RDNA 2 compute units have 64 ALUs, that's FP32 units, floating point operations. Now what this essentially means is they are broken down into two sets. So basically you have two sets of 32, so basically two clusters of 32. What RDNA 3's dual issue does, essentially, is it kind of makes it like there's 128 of those. Now, not all of them, not all use cases will take advantage of this. What it does do is it increases the TFLOP amount by 2x, because, well, it's twice the amount. However, that's a theoretical performance number. And again, not all applications, i.e. for example games, can benefit. Now to my understanding, I don't know whether these changes are in the PS5 Pro or not. I would assume so, because again, I've heard it's based on RDNA 3, however, I have heard it's a very hybrid design, so maybe Sony whipped this out because they said, you know what, this is not going to benefit games, or maybe they've done some customization and it's doing something else on the GPU. I honestly do not know, so I'm just giving you that information. You can kind of take away from it as you will. Now, they also state that the GPU raster performance, so that would be regular visuals in games, is about 60% faster, and ray tracing is 2x faster. Now, I was told by a couple of sources that 2x for raster, so twice the speed of the base model, and 2.5 times for ray tracing. However, I also did get some pushback, and one source essentially told me that that wasn't true, and it was a TFLOP number. And now I honestly don't know which is correct. But my thing is, a 60% improvement for the raster for the Pro console just doesn't seem enough to me, even with a 2x increase in ray tracing. Now, it's very possible that this is simply because, well, I mean, it's almost certain that this is because the GPU is just not running at the clock frequency. My guess is that this number is wrong. I am not certain it is wrong. I certainly could be the one that is wrong. But I'm just saying, from my personal information, based upon the sources I've spoken to, and they've been pretty accurate so far, I do not think that 2 GHz with like a 60% improvement in raster performance would do it. It just, I don't know, I just personally do not see it. Again, I would be very interested if I'm wrong on that, but that's just, you know, my personal opinion. Now we're almost on the home stretch. Let's talk about ROPS. So ROPS are essentially pixel fill rate based. Now these basically assemble the final image that the GPU produces and then sends it to the screen. Now, as you probably can guess, the higher the pixel throughput is a good thing when you're dealing with games which have higher resolution, i.e. it's just a lot harder to run a game at 4K 120 frames a second, just for example, in terms of like pixel throughput, than let's say 1080p 30 frames a second. Now that's a very extreme example, and I'm not likening one to the other, I'm just using it as a very kind of loose metric in your mind. Now what this means is, of course, that it's very unlikely that there were 64 ROPS on the PS5 Pro, even if you say, well, it has the same clock frequency that I was leaking up, even up to 2800 megahertz. It just wouldn't be enough pixel pushing power, at least in my personal opinion, even with like, you know, reconstruction technologies. Now, I was given a figure of 96 ROPS, which is what they are stating here, and also 128. Now, personally speaking, I'm leaning towards 128 being correct, but I always got some pushback as to both numbers, so I honestly do not know which is true. I do not know whether it is 96, and I do not know whether it's 128. If I had to throw a dart, if I was aiming at the dartboard, well, let's just say that this dartboard only had like 2 targets, and one was like 96 and one was 128. I would aim at the 128 one, but again, that is a guess. I am not 100%. They also mention an NPU. This is for things like image reconstruction, etc., etc. I have not heard anything about this personally. Again, that does not mean it is incorrect. That does not mean that they are lying. It is to say that I personally, speaking to sources, they have not heard anything about this. What I will say, and I've mentioned this in a couple of videos, including a more recent one, I was speaking to developers about the PS6 and also the next generation Xbox, and to my understanding, both teams are talking quite extensively now to developers, and they are pushing things like, you know, advanced AI, NPCs, generative AI, that type of stuff. And that's what I was hearing that Sony were doing for the PS6, like some type of maybe NPU. I didn't hear anything about it on the PS5 Pro. I would love to be wrong, because I would be very interested to see what their technologies are. I have also covered on the channel a ray tracing reconstruction, I guess you would call it kind of lecture from Sony, and this was not from a PlayStation team. This was, I think it was like Sony Images or something like that, I don't remember, but they did actually specifically have a PlayStation logo on there, and this was for ray tracing and reconstruction. So what it basically did is it used like AI to fill in the blanks. So when you're doing like a ray traced image, it basically, from the perspective of a camera, so, you know, whatever your field of view is in the game, whether it's first person or third person, whatever, they basically shoot crap tons of rays from the camera's perspective around the scene, and they bounce off of various objects. Well, not all objects obviously will bounce them, some will obviously absorb them. Others obviously would just go off screen totally because they're going into, I don't know, like, you know, the sky or whatever. Others, like a mirrored surface, or, you know, will reflect them back. Others will, you know, reflect them, that type of stuff. Now, what Sony seemed to be working on was some type of technology which basically means that fewer rays could be sent into the scene, and they would use like artificial intelligence to basically piece together the missing detail. Now, again, they were talking about this mostly from the movie context, but they specifically also said about Sony PlayStation. There was a literal conference. I don't know if it's still available, but as of the time, you know, I downloaded it from an official Sony YouTube channel. Now, NVIDIA are already working on stuff like this, kind of, with DLSS 3.5 ray reconstruction. So, you know, this stuff is in the industry already. Now, whether it's part of the PS5 Pro, I do not know. I've heard a lot of mixed things, as always, with this stuff, because the thing is, you can have a target, but it may not be practical for the console, or maybe it's like, it was on the wish list, and then it was just too expensive, or it wouldn't be ready in time, or they did actually hit it. I genuinely do not know, but I think there probably is some new ray tracing reconstruction technologies in the system. I wouldn't be surprised given Sony, but again, I am not certain, and I would suspect that that would probably be done on the GPU. As for the memory, I don't really have anything to say about that. Tom Henderson's leaked 18 Gbps memory. I've leaked it, and I believe 16 gigabytes is correct, unless they've upped it. Sony have done that in the past. After all, the PS4 base model was going to have 4 gigabytes initially, but to my knowledge, it's 16 gigabytes for the main memory. Again, running at 18,000 MTS, which is 576 gigabytes per second bandwidth. And I've also heard that there are 4 gigabytes of DDR5 memory. This is going to be for operating stuff primarily. As a bonus, which isn't mentioned here, so maybe my information is incorrect, or they've just not leaked it, or whatever. I've also heard that the Tempest engine also got bolstered as well for the PS5 Pro, and this does stuff like, of course, audio. So, yeah, I think that's about everything in this video. It's turned out to be a bit ramblier than normal. I apologize for that. Tom Henderson on Twitter, a couple of people messaged me about this as well. Apparently Sony are going to be fully disclosing the specifications in the next month or so of the PS5 Pro. So I will obviously cover that because I'm very curious, because Tom's got a really good track record. I've spoken to him a few times in DM, not about this specifically, this leak specifically, excuse me. He's got a really good track record, so when he leaks stuff, I will be very interested to know what is and isn't, correct from what I'm hearing, because again, my information could be wrong. Like, I'm not going to stand here and say that my information's, totally right. I could be wrong, but I believe some of the stuff here doesn't sound quite right, especially the clock frequency in the GPU. That, I don't know, that just sounds a bit off to me. Who knows? With that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video and my rambling. Take care of yourselves, guys. Normal stuff, if you have enjoyed the video, so I've got an itch, which is very poor timing. Normal stuff, guys, if you have enjoyed the video, subscribe and, leave a like, because it does help out a lot. Also, again, thank you to everyone who has messaged, emailed, contacted me about this. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.